This is the first lecture for Monday, April 20th. We're continuing on with our examination of ecosystem ecology. For this last full week of the class, we're going to focus on initially nutrients and elements, and then by the end of the week we should be done with that and on to human interactions for the last couple of lectures. So we were looking at the flow of energy through ecosystems, and we're looking at the cycling of nutrients within ecosystems, and recognized there was important differences in how those two materials move through ecosystems. And we looked at nutrient cycling and some of the major differences, very different set of circumstances on land versus water. And we're looking at this last aspect that we looked at to a certain degree already when we covered the topic of ecological succession. But there's this idea of disturbance and nutrient cycling, specifically not just talking about disturbance and succession, but talking about disturbance and its influence on nutrient cycling, a specific part of the process of ecological succession, but focusing on the cycling of nutrients rather than all these different changes that take place and the different theories or different hypotheses about how disturbance is related to ecological stability and succession. So just to reiterate, we looked at succession, and we saw that disturbance in some communities and some ecosystems is a natural thing. If there's some disturbance, the community recovers from that disturbance and eventually might reach a climax community. Maybe it doesn't reach a climax community because there's a series of regular disturbances that set things back to a certain point. Not all the way back to a barren landscape, but back to a certain point. So, in addition to all the different organisms in a community, this disturbance also has an influence on nutrients. And there's different levels of disturbance that apply to terrestrial ecosystems and that apply to aquatic ecosystems. So I just want to spend a little time talking about what kind of effects disturbance has on nutrient cycling, especially in aquatic ecosystems. So there are all kinds of examples of disturbance. There's some natural disturbances that occur: fires, storms, floods, landslides, those kind of things. And there's also a huge degree of human influence in terms of disturbances. Humans have a big influence on disturbances. That's what we're going to look at towards the end of this semester, the last couple of lectures. So one example is flooding. Now, some flooding has been caused by humans, exacerbated by humans, but flooding is a natural phenomenon as well. It's a natural form of disturbance. So if you look at a stream, for instance, and you look at the stream flow versus the amount of phosphorus within that stream. So phosphorus, we've seen, is an important component of ATP. That's what the P is. Every DNA, every RNA has a phosphate, which contains phosphorus. So it's obviously it's an important element, and phosphate is an important molecule in living things. So in the cycle of disturbance, when a stream experiences flooding, then the amount of phosphorus that's exported away from the stream, or made unavailable for the organisms that are in that stream, it increases. And so if you look at this figure, and you can see that to the right of this, the stream flow is getting higher and higher. So there's years where there's a lot of flooding. There's years where there's a lot less flooding. And in terms of the amount of, this is phosphorus in this case, but you could look at nitrogen, you could look at carbon, could look at silica, calcium, whatever the element was, in terms of it being transported downstream. So this is just one little stream, this one brook. And so you can see that in the dark colored part of the figure on the top, there's a net export of this element, phosphorus, downstream. So it's taken out of the stream because the water is flowing at a higher level, the impact of flooding. And again, you could look at this for any other element, nitrogen, some of these that are really important. And so you get an idea of, in terms of the availability of these nutrients, the importance of these nutrients for growth and the ability of organisms to survive, if you're talking about animals, but also for photosynthetic organisms, it's going to influence the amount of primary productivity. Well, another example is when there's an increased input, not the result of these being exported out of an ecosystem by something like flooding, but humans have a huge influence in terms of, it's a big component of sewage is this nitrogenous waste that we have in our sewers. There's different forms of nitrogen. We'll actually look at this in a little while. But there's a huge amount of nitrogen that's input especially into water. A lot of nitrogen into soil that makes its way into bodies of water. There's runoff across the land and percolating through the soil, and eventually makes its way into waterways. And there's a lot of direct input of nitrogen. If you look at the amount of nitrogen that's in a body of water that's got people around it, like Narragansett Bay, for instance, huge amount of nitrogen input from different sources. Some major in the sewage, and other ones from agriculture or golf courses, runoff through people's yards, those kind of things, especially when you consider some of the major components of fertilizers that people are putting on their crops or their golf courses, or all the different individuals on their lawns. But nitrogen is a big input. It's a big fertilizer, a big limiting nutrient, and so is phosphorus. Again, if you look at phosphorus, this figure here shows phosphorus in terms of it being added to bodies of water around urban areas. This big giant blue column in that histogram in the bottom, the proportion of export of phosphorus, and it makes its way into these bodies of water. And so you've got a lot of phosphorus. Nitrogen would illustrate a similar type of figure as is shown down there on the bottom. So there's a huge amount of these nutrients that are important for growth, that are important for algae blooming, for these phytoplankton blooming, big increases in their population. And that's exactly what happens. There's a population explosion of these primary producers, especially in shallow bodies of water where there's a lot of light. Usually, nutrients are somewhat limiting, and so these phytoplankton don't grow out of control. The algae don't have these big giant population explosions. But this eutrophication, this buildup of these nutrients and the population explosion of these primary producers, then there's the result usually is that the oxygen that's in these waters is used up pretty quickly, not by the plants, but by things that are feeding on the plants or the phytoplankton or the algae. And you have these anoxic zones. This happens in Narragansett Bay all the time, every summer. And there's different parts where there's these big fish kills because of the lack of oxygen. Anyway, this is another example of disturbance in ecosystems specifically tied to nutrients, and how a few examples of how nutrients and the disturbance with the flow cycling of nutrients can impact ecosystems, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a negative way, especially when you take into consideration the role of humans. All right, well, let's turn our attention then to the cycling of materials. Now, most of these are going to be elements, but some of these are going to be not in the elemental form. They're going to take a number of forms. When we look at nitrogen, for example, there's different types of nitrogen. Carbon, there's different forms of carbon. Carbon's bonded to something else, so is nitrogen. Water is different in terms of the water cycle. And then, in addition to 1, 2, and 3, water, carbon, and nitrogen, we're going to look at some other ones as well, phosphorus and sulfur. So first of all, water. Now, obviously, water is important for living things. Every living thing needs water. If you're talking about aquatic systems, then there's an abundance of water for the most part. You have all the water you want. You have to deal with salts sometimes, or you have to deal with these nutrients that are limiting in some aquatic systems. But water is pretty easy. If you live on land, though, then that's a whole different set of circumstances. And on land, and for terrestrial organisms, water is a scarce commodity. Water is really, really important. And water has a huge influence on the evolution of organisms that live on land. So we're going to look at cycling of water basically through the whole Earth, the whole biosphere, where living things are. And we're going to see water has a number of different forms. You know, water is in a liquid form, which is water, but it's also, it evaporates and it's in a gaseous form as water vapor, and that condenses and it rains or snows. It just snowed last night here where I live. And there's also solid forms of water in certain parts of the earth when water freezes. So we're going to look at these different phases of water moving through ecosystems. There's these 7 different forms of water, 7 different roles that water plays in ecosystems. So we'll look at those not in a whole lot of detail, but at least to recognize the flow of water through ecosystems. Now, of course, water is taken out of the environment and incorporated into the cells and bodies of living things. So in terms of all these different changes that take place, for instance, with nitrogen changing different forms, or carbon changing forms, it's not going to be so involved, but it's just the transport of water from these different locations and somewhat in different phases, but for the most part, it's either liquid or it's gaseous forms. So the water moves through ecosystems powered by the sun and by gravity as well. Water flows downhill. And it's the same for nutrients in general, that there's these 2 big movers of nutrients through ecosystems, the sun and gravity, one way or the other. So water moves around. There's air masses that have water in them, clouds basically that move around, that are distributed all around. So the wind is a big influencer of water movement. And then gravity is another one. Like I said, water flows downhill from the mountains, eventually down to the ocean. And so looking at water vapor specifically, there's water vapor in the air. And we quantify this as in terms of humidity. How much water is there in the air? Then you could look at absolute humidity or relative humidity, which is what you hear on the news all the time. The relative humidity is such and such a percent. That is reflected in terms of temperature. At a certain temperature, there's a certain amount of water that can be held, water vapor that can be held in the air. So this relative humidity is how much there is compared to how much there potentially could be at a certain temperature. There's also the dew point that you hear sometimes, the temperature at which the water comes out of the water vapor and it condenses and forms liquid. So there's humidity that you hear, oh, it's really humid. If you watch the weather report On the news, they often talk about the relative humidity, and you have a sense of this if you're out walking around, if you're experiencing the air in terms of how damp it feels or how humid it feels. It's all something that we recognize. There's different parts of the United States that are really humid, like the East Coast, versus parts that are really not very humid at all, dry, especially out west. So in terms of the water cycle, this summarizes where water is found in ecosystems and how water moves through ecosystems and the relative proportion of the volume of water that you find in these different locations. So if you look in the ocean, there's a huge amount of water in the oceans. If you look at water on continents, then there's a lot of water in the continents, but it's a fraction of what you find in the ocean. And then if you look at water that you find in the atmosphere, water that's in the form of vapor, you see those numbers in this figure, much smaller percentages or quantities of water that you find in the air. But you see air that contains these condensation nuclei, whatever they are, particles of dust or other things that water can condense around. And then there's different atmospheric conditions, pressure, temperature that leads to the formation of precipitation. Water, it rains or it snows or it hails, whatever, some kind of form of water that comes out of the air, out of the clouds, and then comes to earth. Some of that on land, and some of that on big bodies of water. So in terms of the water cycle, if you have this water, a certain amount of water as in the form of water vapor, and there's different processes that lead to this water vapor coming out of the air and raining or snowing, but mostly raining, then most of this, as you can imagine, the 70%, 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by the ocean. So most of this rain falls on the ocean. But there's a lot that occurs over land, and some of that goes into the sediment, some of it goes into the soil and into the aquifer, into the geology of whatever part of the land that is, and some of it remains on the surface in the form of lakes with rivers and streams, and it eventually runs down to the ocean. And then there's a certain amount that's frozen. In the poles, it's getting smaller and smaller. And so water is transported around. Well, it rains, and then it evaporates out of the ocean, and then it's back up into the atmosphere. The clouds blown around, the wind blows it around, transports it around. So water is moving constantly all throughout the earth. It's being redistributed. And along with that water, there's certain things that are dissolved in water. Water's a good solvent. So there's different nutrients that are dissolved in there. There's different things, some that are good, some that are bad in terms of creating pH changes and those kind of things. And this evaporation, condensation, precipitation also is a good purifier of water. That's really what we do when we distill water. And another process that incorporates a lot of nutrients and that changes the earth quite a bit is erosion. There's different forms of erosion, but a major form of erosion is from water. It could be waves crashing on the rocks, or it could be rivers, streams that are moving across the landscape and altering the geology of an area by erosion. And of course, there's a huge influence from humans in terms of water. We're thirsty as humans. We have a lot of need for water. And so we've altered the aquifers of water for different places. Certain places there's shortages of water. Everybody needs water. If you have cities, they need water. If you have agriculture, they need water to water their crops. Golf courses need water there. Everybody needs water their lawn. So there's a lot of cases where there's not enough water to go around. And we also alter the landscape a lot. We make things barren. We create a lot of erosion. We destroy different vegetation. We have a lot of cement and asphalt and hard surfaces, especially around developed parts, cities, where there's a huge amount of runoff. Normally that rain would be soaked up into the soil, but all this cement, these roads and buildings and parking lots, all this water runs off. And so there's increased runoffs and some of these effects, negative effects, that humans have on the water cycle and the availability of water to a whole bunch of different organisms out there. Now, we can't influence the distribution of water and the water cycle to a large extent because it's on such a big scale, but we're certainly having effects on local scales. All right, the next thing for us to look at is carbon, and we'll do that in the second lecture.